eliminating modern slavery from supply chains. Can Nestle lead the way? Syeda Masiha Kumrai CFAI Business School, Hyderabad. In April 2019, a federal court in California filed a class action lawsuit against Nestle. Nestle, over claims the global chocolate manufacturer facilitated the use of forced child labor in West Africa even though it labeled its products as sustainably sourced. Nestle, one of the world's largest food processing companies, had been grappling with accusations of aiding and abetting child slavery on cocoa plantations in Ivory Coast for more than a decade. Earlier in 2015, Nestle surprised many by admitting that it had found forced labor in its seafood supply chain in Thailand. Magdi Batato, executive vice president and head of operations at Nestle, self-reported that Nestle had uncovered child labor exploitation on fishing boats in Thailand that supplied its factories. He reported details of the investigation and also initiated a detailed action plan on how it intended to tackle the issue. The news generated a mixed response from industry observers. Hailing Nestle's honesty, Brian Griffin, CEO of digital marketing agency Vero PR, said, "First of all, what Nestle did was brave, and from a moral perspective, they did the right thing to let stakeholders know about this issue. They will feel some pain from this initially, particularly from a consumer standpoint, and it's not hard to imagine that sales of seafood products may decline. There is no question that the issue must be cleaned up, and that it must happen now. We should appreciate what Nestle has done to bring even more attention to the issue, too." However, Nestle's critics contended that the company had done this only to fend off growing criticism against it. It had admitted to slavery in seafood, a low-profit area of the company's business, while not doing enough to tackle this problem in its lucrative chocolate business. Critics accused Nestle of turning a blind eye to human rights abuses by cocoa suppliers in West Africa while falsely portraying itself as a socially and ethically responsible company. Nestle said it was committed to tackling child labor in its cocoa supply chain and had been taking action to address the issue, which included increasing access to education, stepping up systems of age verification at cocoa farms, and increasing awareness about the company's own code of conduct. Despite Nestle's assurances, the use of child labor continued and became even more prevalent in its cocoa supply chains. Though Nestle's commitment to eliminating slavery seemed promising, lawsuits related to slavery in its core business operations questioned such promises. Critics said the existence of modern slavery within its cocoa supply chain posed ethical and reputational risks for Nestle. Analysts said addressing slavery would be a critical issue for the company going forward due to the complexity and limited visibility of its supply chain, its reputation for reliability among stakeholders, customers, investors, NGOs, transparency dilemmas, as well as cost and pricing pressures. However, some analysts said Nestle, being a financially sound company, it could do more to stop slave labor and take more control over its supply chain management. According to Marianne Smallwood, a diplomat for the U.S. Agency for International Development, in initiating the public examination of its flaws, and in working with an organization like Verite, Nestle has already gone a more honorable and transparent route than other companies have done. But while it has taken the first step toward being a more responsible company, Nestle's commitment to funding a long-term strategy, and how it pushes beyond the inevitable roadblocks ahead, will determine its ultimate footprint and legacy. 3. According to Batato, every reasonable person who has gone to Africa, gone to Asia, who has seen the farmers and factories, can tell you that child labor does exist. It is part of their life. Do we accept it? No. Are we going to stay quiet and do nothing? No. But making a big declaration that tomorrow morning we are going to see it disappear, sometimes the problem is bigger than us, bigger than a company even the size of Nestle. 4. Nevertheless, the critical questions before him were how to eliminate forced labor from Nestle's supply chains world over. Could he address the problem and bring real and sustained change in how the company's cocoa supply chains were managed? Background note: Nestle, headquartered in Vevey, Switzerland, was founded in 1866. One of the leading players in the food and beverage categories, The company had a global presence and employed more than 328,000 people as of 2017. Its sales and profits for the year 2016 were CHF 89.5 billion and CHF 8.53 billion respectively. 5. Though Nestle was among the world's largest food processing companies and had great consumer brands well known for their quality, critics pointed out that there seemed to be an element of arrogance in its actions. 6. The company had a history of confrontations over a range of issues. 7. There were instances of Nestle being accused of disregarding its corporate responsibility in many countries in which it operated. The Swiss conglomerate had had its fair share of controversies and ethical dilemmas during its nearly 150-year-long history. 8. Experts pointed out that the history of Nestlé's public relations troubles began in the 1970s with allegations of unethical marketing of baby Formula 9 in less developed countries. 10. Since then, Nestlé had continued to get into trouble. For instance, in 2008, it was blacklisted by the Chinese government. 11. Later, it was targeted for the misleading promotion of its bottled water brands as well as for interfering in policies that protected natural water resources. 12. In the United Kingdom, the Ethical Consumer Research Association, ECRA, 13 gave Nestlé an ethical rating, Ethiscore 14 of 0.5 out of 20. ECRA had found the company to be linked to social ills such as child labour, slavery, rainforest destruction, water extraction, and debt perpetuation. Critics pointed out that in 2005, when it launched the Partners Blend Fair Trade 15 coffee, Nestlé was termed as the UK's most boycotted and irresponsible corporation. 16. Modern slavery and global supply chains. Modern slavery could be described as control by people or organisations over vulnerable individuals in order to obtain personal gain or profit. Modern slavery included forced labour, debt bondage, child labour, wage exploitation, human trafficking, forced marriage, involuntary domestic servitude, or any other practice wherein victims were engaged in unreasonable work through physical or mental threat. According to the 2017 Global Slavery Index, about 40.3 million people were victims of some form of modern slavery globally. Of these people, about 24.9 million were in forced labour. The rate of modern slavery was reported to be the highest in Africa, with 7.6 victims for every 1,000 people in the region. See Exhibits 1 and 2. Modern slavery had broader social and economic costs, in terms of impeding economic development and perpetuating poverty, said experts. According to them, globalization had led companies to turn to lower-cost suppliers who sourced cheaper raw materials and used low-wage labor in order to maximize profits. According to an ILO report, forced labor generated about $150 billion in illegal profits annually. Analysts pointed out that slavery was an abuse of human rights in the pursuit of profits and that corporations had a moral duty not to indulge in or tolerate it. Addressing human rights and labor issues in the supply chain had become a necessity for businesses in the consumer goods industry, they said. This was partly due to rising consumer demand for ethical products. Several governments had enacted legislations which mandated that companies ensure respect for human rights in their supply chains. As shown in Exhibit 3, a number of anti-modern slavery regulations had also come into existence. The California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, signed in 2010 and enacted on the 1st of January, 2012, was one of the first anti-modern slavery regulations. This act aimed to ensure that large anti-modern slavery regulations year Regulation 2000 the United Nations passes the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons as part of the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. It is the first global legally binding treaty with an internationally agreed definition of trafficking in persons. 2002 The International Cocoa Initiative is established as a joint effort of anti-slavery groups and major chocolate companies to protect children and contribute to the elimination of child labor. 2004 The United Nations appoints a special rapporteur on human trafficking. 2008 The Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings comes into force. 2010 California enacts the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. 2014 The ILO adopts a protocol on forced labor. bringing its 1930 Convention on Forced Labor into the modern era to address practices such as human trafficking. 2015 Britain's Modern Slavery Act comes into force. 2015 The United Nations adopts 17 Sustainable Development Goals, including a target of ending slavery and eradicating forced labor and human trafficking. Compiled from various sources, retailers and manufacturers provides consumers with information regarding their efforts to eradicate slavery and human trafficking from their supply chains. The United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, UNGPs, were endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in June 2011. These were a set of guidelines for states and companies to prevent, address, and remedy human rights abuses committed in business operations. The UNGPs, based on the three pillars protect, respect, and remedy, had since become the trusted global framework for business and human rights. The most prominent of anti-slavery regulations was the UK Modern Slavery Act, passed on the 26th of March, 2015. It required businesses with a turnover of more than £36 million annually to produce a slavery and human trafficking statement once a year, disclosing what action they had taken to ensure their supply chains were free of slave labour. Experts felt that though the legislation did not impose financial penalties on companies that failed to comply, the adverse effects of being prosecuted for failing to do so could lead to reputational risks and could be more damaging than any fine. Child slavery in Nestlé's cocoa supply chain. Nestlé was a leader in the chocolate confectionery industry and used 10% of the world's cocoa production. It worked directly with almost 165,000 direct suppliers and 695,000 individual farmers worldwide for procuring raw materials such as cocoa, dairy, sugar, coffee, etc. Nestlé primarily sourced cocoa from co-ops and farms in Ivory Coast and Ghana. Nestlé purchased around 414,000 tons of cocoa annually for chocolate and confectionery as well as beverages. The cocoa supply chain includes many intermediaries between the farmer and consumer. Small farmers typically sell their cocoa harvest to local middlemen for cash. The middlemen work under contract for local exporters, who, in turn, sell cocoa to international traders and the major international cocoa brands. Allegations of child labour and human rights abuses in its cocoa and agricultural supply chains had dogged Nestlé for years. Since the late 1990s, Nestlé and its competitors had received negative publicity and media coverage over their use of child slave labour and the lack of transparency within their cocoa supply chain. Though Nestlé's corporate business principles and supplier code prohibited both child and forced labour, Nestlé was aware that cocoa beans from Ivory Coast were produced using child labour. While Nestlé and its competitors vied for market share and profits, cocoa farmers suffered due to low income attributed to the fall in the price of cocoa beans. Cocoa bean futures on the Intercontinental Exchange in New York hit $2,052 per metric ton on the 3rd of February, 2017, compared to $3,422 per metric ton in December 2015. Many farmers felt that child labour was a viable option in order to cut production and work costs. As a result, child slavery had become extremely prevalent throughout the cocoa supply chain, and there had been minimal action taken by the chocolate manufacturing companies to stop the exploitation of these children. The practice of child labour was rampant in the cocoa industry, wherein harvesting and processing of the cocoa plant was left to children, often unpaid and living in slavery. See Exhibit 4. Some children were sold by their parents to traffickers, while many were kidnapped. Reportedly, they worked from dawn to dusk each day, were denied sufficient food, and locked in a shed at night where they were given a tiny cup in which to urinate. 17 Some children were forced to do unsafe tasks, including carrying heavy loads, using machetes and sharp tools, and applying pesticides and fertilizers. The rules and regulations are so lax there that there is no government to step in and stop the atrocities. This horrific state of child slavery is also the perfect cheap labour for candy companies that want to sell you chocolate for dirt cheap prices. Why do you think it only costs $1 for a chocolate bar? 18 wrote journalist L.J. Veneer. The growing awareness about child slaves working in the production of cocoa led to consumers questioning where exactly their chocolate was coming from and who was making it. In 2001, following pressure and outrage from civil society groups, media, and the general public. 8 chocolate manufacturing companies in the United States, including Nestle, signed the Harkin-Engel Protocol 19 to investigate the labor practices and eliminate the worst forms of child labor in the processing of cocoa in Ivory Coast and Ghana by 2005. However, when the 2005 deadline arrived, the companies had yet to eradicate child labor from their supply chains. The target was then extended to 2008. Unable to meet the new self-imposed deadline again, in 2010, the signatories of the protocol started afresh with a treaty called the Declaration of Joint Action to implement the Harkin-Engel Protocol and to reduce the worst forms of child labor by 70% across the cocoa plantations of Ivory Coast by 2020. In 2005, a lawsuit was filed against Nestle, Archer Daniels Midland Co. 20, and Cargill Incorporated 21 by 3 former child slavery victims originally from Mali in West Africa who alleged that these companies aided and abetted human rights violations through their active involvement in purchasing cocoa in Ivory Coast. The lawsuit claimed that the companies were aware of the child slavery problem and offered financial and technical assistance to local farmers to procure the cheapest source of cocoa. In court documents, the 3 plaintiffs claimed that they had been trafficked from their homes and put to work on plantations in Ivory Coast. They described how they had been whipped, beaten, and forced to work for 14 to 16 hours a day before being allowed to retire to their dark rooms. One plaintiff recounted how guards would slice open the feet of any child worker who tried to escape. The lawsuit accused Nestle of making false assertions to consumers and not disclosing that its suppliers relied on child laborers to procure cocoa at the point of purchase. Nestle said that the claims against it should be dismissed as it was committed to the goal of eliminating child labor from its cocoa supply chain, claiming that the lawsuit was without merit. Nestle said that proactive and multi-stakeholder efforts were required to eradicate child labor, not lawsuits. Forced child labor is a complex, global social issue in foreign countries that is not going to be solved by lawsuits in U.S. courts against the very companies that are leading the fight to help eradicate it, 22 said Paul Backus, president of corporate affairs, Nestle USA. After a first dismissal in 2008, the case was examined again and the lawsuit was reinstated by the U.S. Court of Appeals in San Francisco in 2014 on the grounds that the plaintiffs had valid reasons to accuse Nestle of pursuing profits more than human well-being. In October 2009, Nestle launched a company-wide initiative called the Nestle Cocoa Plan, TNCP, in collaboration with International Cocoa Initiative 23, ICI. In order to ensure a sustainable future for the cocoa industry worldwide and the communities depending on it. The goal of TNCP was to help cocoa farmers run profitable farms, respect the environment, have a good quality of life and for their children to benefit from education and see cocoa farming as a respectable profession. 24 To achieve this, Nestle committed CHF 110 million to the plan for 10 years and pledged to source 230,000 megatons of cocoa through TNCP by 2020. Despite the industry's assurances, critics contended that the worst forms of child labor continued in Ivory Coast. Amid accusations of failing to carry out checks on child labor in its cocoa supply chain, in November 2011, Nestle commissioned Fair Labor Association, FLA, 25 to assess its cocoa supply chain in Ivory Coast. The goals of the assessment were to map stakeholders involved in Nestle's cocoa supply chain and to analyze the associated labor risks in its cocoa supply chain. The assessment team mapped the cocoa supply chain in depth, including Nestle's headquarters in Switzerland, R&D in Abidjan, local operations in the Ivory Coast, Tier 1 suppliers of Nestle and their subsidiaries in West Africa, processing facilities and buying centers in the Ivory Coast, third-party service providers, Pistures 26 cooperatives, Trayton's 27 farmers, Matea's 28 Cox's 29 and workers. See Exhibit 5. A team of 20 local and international experts visited a total of 7 suppliers, 20 cooperatives, and 2 cooperative unions, and 87 farms. In all, over 500 interviews were conducted with farmers and other stakeholders in the supply chain, including local community members, local governments, NGOs, suppliers, and Nestle staff. The FLA released the results of its audit in 2012, finding continued evidence of child labour in the Ivory Coast farms supplying Nestle. The researchers found 56 workers under the age of 18, of whom 27 were under 15. According to Steve Berman, managing partner at law firm Hagens Berman Sobel Shapiro LLP, they claim they've been taking steps. They partner with the Fair Labour Association to investigate, and they claim they are committed to eradicating it. But the fact is the recent reports show the number of children in the cocoa industry has increased. We doubt that Nestle is taking this very seriously. 30 Moreover, Nestle's claims that it had made progress toward meeting the Harkin-Engel Protocol fell flat when a 2015 report from the Payson Center for International Development of Tulane University, sponsored by the U.S. Department of Labor, found that the number of children engaged in cocoa production in Ivory Coast had increased 51% to 1.4 million in 2013 to 2014, compared to 791,181 children engaged in such work in 2008 to 2009. However, Nestle defended itself, stating, "Cocoa supply chain is long and complex, making it difficult for food companies to establish exactly where their cocoa comes from and under what conditions it was harvested." 31 Nestle's failure to bring transparency into its supply chain again came under the public spotlight in September when consumers filed 3 class action lawsuits against Nestle, the Hershey Company, and Mars Incorporated for allegedly using child labor in chocolate production. The lawsuit stated that in violation of California law, the companies did not disclose that their suppliers in Ivory Coast relied on child laborers and instead continued to profit by tricking consumers into indirectly supporting the use of such labor. According to the complaint, Nestle, as one of the largest companies in the world, can dictate the terms by which cocoa beans are produced and supplied to it, including the labor conditions in the supply chain. But through its own inadequate efforts over the course of decades, Nestle is presently not able to trace all of the cocoa beans that make up its chocolate products back to the cocoa plantations on which they are grown, much less ensure that the cocoa beans are not the product of child or slave labor. And meanwhile, Nestle continues to profit from the child and forced labor that is used to make its chocolate products. This is shameful. 32 Nestle's initiatives to address the issue following the findings of the FLA report. Nestle set out to address child labor by undertaking the 11 recommendations the FLA had made to it, which included strengthening the Nestle supplier code, increasing accountability from the various tiers of suppliers, and developing a robust and comprehensive internal monitoring and remediation system. Reiterating the promise made in 2001, Nestle said it was taking action to progressively eliminate child labor in cocoa growing areas by assessing individual cases and tackling the root causes. The use of child labor is unacceptable and goes against everything Nestle stands for. Nestle is committed to following and respecting all international laws and is dedicated to the goal of eradicating child labor from our cocoa supply chain. 33 The company said in a statement, in 2012, Nestle was the first cocoa purchaser to set up a child labor monitoring and remediation system, CLMRS, in Ivory Coast in association with ICI. See Exhibit 6. The system locally recruited community liaison people and child labor agents who worked to raise awareness about child labor in communities, identified children at risk, and reported their findings to Nestle and its suppliers. By the end of 2015, the system covered 40 cooperatives and 26,000 cocoa farmers. In 2016, the CLMRS was extended to a further 29 cooperatives, taking the total to 69. As of August 2019, CLMRS covered 1,751 communities in Côte d'Ivoire compared to 1,553 in 201,734 as shown in Exhibit 7. The number of children monitored increased from 40,728 in 2017 to 78,580 in 2019. Half of the identified children were included in CLMRS and sent to school, while income-generating activities were developed for their families. Nestle built 49 schools in Ivory Coast to help end unlawful child labor. Despite this, Allegations that the company was not doing enough continued. According to a spokesperson from Nestle, unfortunately, the scale and complexity of the issue is such that no company sourcing cocoa from Ivory Coast can guarantee that it has completely removed the risk of child labor from its supply chain. 35 Earlier in 2010, Nestle entered into a partnership with the Danish Institute for Human Rights 36, DIHR, to support its commitment to respecting human rights as stated in the company's corporate business principles. As part of this commitment, Nestle developed and implemented an 8-pillar human rights due diligence program, HRDD, shown in Exhibit 8 with the aim of making Nestle's approach to human rights strategic, comprehensive, and coordinated. As part of the program, Nestle Step 1, the Community Liaison Person CLP, visits the households and farms of every member of the Nestle Cocoa Plan Cooperative to gather basic information on the issue. Step 2, a child is spotted, or self-declares, engaging in a hazardous activity. Step 7, the child is monitored to ensure the process is successful, and the effectiveness of the remediation activities is critically reviewed on an ongoing basis. Step 6, ICI, or one of its local partners, implements or distributes remediation support to the child and or their parents. Step 5, ICI analyses the data coming from a cooperative, identifies trends and suggests a palette of remediation activities that will be implemented by ICI with the support of the CLA and CLP. Step 4, at the cooperative level, the child labor agent, CLA, verifies the information and validates the report submitted by the CLP. Step 3, this information is entered into a centralized database via mobile app. Nestle Human Rights Due Diligence Program HRDD Pillar Components 1 Policy Commitments revised 17 different corporate policies, standards, and commitments to incorporate the relevant human rights elements. These include Nestle's corporate business principles, responsible sourcing standard, employee relations policy, consumers communication policy and privacy policy. 2 Stakeholder engagement partnered with expert organizations such as the Danish Institute for Human Rights, DIHR, the Fair Labor Association, Cocoa and Hazelnuts, and Verite, Fish and Seafood, and Coffee, to develop policies and procedures, and improve performance on the ground. 3 Training and awareness rolled out human rights training programs to raise awareness of human rights issues among employees and develop their skills in dealing with them. As of 2018, Nestle trained about 96,599 employees for risk evaluation, integrated human rights risks within its enterprise risk management framework and market compliance committees. 5 Salient issues carried out business risk and impact assessments at the corporate level and on the ground and identified 11 most salient human rights issues and developed dedicated action plans to address them. 6 Governance established clear roles and responsibilities at different levels of the company and set up boards and committees to assess, work and lead the strategic implementation of human rights work. 7 Grievance mechanisms identified and enabled effective remediation across countries and industries. 8 Monitoring and reporting reviewed progress and performance regularly as the company was publicly accountable for its promises. Source: http://www.nestle.com/csv/communities/respecting-human-rights continued to tackle child labor in its cocoa supply chain in Ivory Coast by focusing on vulnerable groups, especially girls and children of migrant workers. In 2015, Nestle was one of the early adopters of the UNGP reporting framework to effectively manage human rights in its operations. This framework was based on the global standard of the UNGPs. In October 2015, Batato 37 was appointed as Executive Vice President and Head of Operations at Nestlé. Batato controlled all 500 of Nestle's manufacturing facilities around the world. He was also responsible for Nestlé's rural development activities and procurement. Nestlé operated a child labor and women's empowerment steering group, chaired by Batato, to identify measures, take decisions, and monitor progress. In 2016, Nestlé increased the amount of cocoa purchased through TNCP to 140,933 tons at a cost of about CHF 30 million. By 2017, the company planned to source 150,000 tons of cocoa through TNCP and 230,000 tons by 2020. The company claimed that its Kit Kat brand had become the first global confectionery brand to be sourced from 100% certified cocoa. In order to strengthen its cocoa bean supply in a responsible way, Nestle encouraged its supplying farms to be UTZ 38 certified. The process included farm selection and farmer training in good agricultural practices, health and safety, and care for the environment. Farmer compliance was checked by both Nestle agronomists and an external auditor. Nestle admits to forced labor following allegations that it was using slave labor to catch and process fish for its popular Fancy Feast cat food. In early 2015, Nestle commissioned Verite 39, a human rights watchdog, to conduct an investigation into 6 of its production sites in Thailand. Verite conducted a 3-month assessment into the possibility of forced labor and human trafficking in Nestle's Thai supply chain. The investigation was targeted specifically at the vessel-to-marketplace shrimp and fish meal supply chain. Verite interviewed more than 100 people, including about 80 workers from Myanmar and Cambodia, as well as boat owners, shrimp farm owners, site supervisors, and representatives of Nestle suppliers. It visited fishing ports, fish meal packing plants, shrimp farms, and docked fishing boats in Thailand. Verite found indicators of forced labor, human trafficking, and child labor present in land and sea-based workers at the sites assessed. These indicators included deceptive recruitment practices, little or no employment protections for workers, restriction on the freedom of movement of workers, and instances of both verbal and physical abuse. According to the Verite study, workers were either sold as slaves to seafood suppliers in Thailand, or trapped in the fishing industry through false promises and debt bondage. Often trafficked from Thailand's neighbouring countries such as Cambodia and Myanmar, the labourers were sold to fishing boat captains needing crews to man their fishing boats. According to the report, the work was strenuous with shifts lasting up to 20 hours a day with little or no pay, and refusal to work to a supervisor's satisfaction led to beatings or sometimes even death. Sometimes, the net is too heavy and workers get pulled into the water and just disappear. When someone dies, he gets thrown into the water. Some have fallen overboard, 40 said a Burmese worker to Verite. While Nestle had publicly accepted the findings of the report, Verite said this problem was not unique to Nestle's supply chain but rather systemic in nature within the vulnerable migrant worker communities in Thailand. Meanwhile, in August 2015, pet food buyers filed a class action lawsuit against Nestle for importing fish-based pet food 41 from suppliers in Thailand who used slave labor. According to the lawsuit, Nestle supported a system of slave labor and human trafficking to distribute and market its Purina brand Fancy Feast cat food while hiding its involvement in human rights violations from the public. Nestle had partnered with Thai Union Frozen Products PCL to import seafood-based pet food for its Purina pet food brand. Melanie Barber, the plaintiff, alleged that Nestle had violated consumer protection statutes by failing to disclose that some ingredients in its cat food products contained seafood which was sourced from forced labor. She argued that Nestle was obliged to make additional disclosures at the point of sale regarding the probability that the product contained seafood sourced from forced labor. According to Berman, by hiding this from public view, Nestle has effectively tricked millions of consumers into supporting and encouraging slave labor on floating prisons. It's a fact that the thousands of purchasers of its top-selling pet food products would not have bought this brand had they known the truth that hundreds of individuals are enslaved, beaten or even murdered in the production of its pet food. 42 The alleged violations were brought under the California Unfair Competition Law, UCL, the California Legal Remedies Act, and the California False Advertising Law. Nestle applied for the lawsuit to be dismissed, arguing that it could rely on so-called safe harbor provisions, as the company had made specific disclosures on forced labor issues as required by the California Transparency in Supply Chain Acts of 2010. After fending off allegations, in November 2015, Nestle took observers by surprise when it publicly admitted that its seafood supply chain was tainted by modern slavery. The company emphasized that no other company sourcing seafood from Thailand, the world's third largest seafood exporter, could have avoided being exposed to the same risks. 43 in 2015, Batato, in a brave move self, reported that Nestle had uncovered child labor exploitation on fishing boats in Thailand that supplied its factories. According to industry observers, the disclosure came as a surprise as international companies rarely acknowledged abuses in their supply chains. Some analysts felt that Nestle's voluntary disclosure could boost its ethical image and possibly shifts the parameters of what could be expected of businesses when it came to supply chain accountability. Nestle's decision to conduct this investigation is to be applauded. If you've got one of the biggest brands in the world proactively coming out and admitting that they have found slavery in their business operations, then it's potentially a huge game changer and could lead to real and sustained change in how supply chains are managed. 44 said Nick Crono, CEO of NGO The Freedom Fund. In December 2015, the Central District of California dismissed the lawsuit on the grounds that the California Act had created a safe harbor under which companies were sheltered from liability when they accurately complied with the limited disclosure obligations that the law mandated. Following Verité's investigation and its own admission, Nestlé launched an action plan on seafood sourced from Thailand, which included a series of actions to protect workers from abuses and improve working conditions. See Exhibit 9. The plan included commitments to establish an emergency response team with various partners to remediate risks and take short-term action to protect workers. Responsible sourcing of seafood. Thailand Action Plan 2015 to 2016 Objective Action incorporate new business requirements into commercial relationship. Based on the current signature of the Nestlé Supplier Code, work closely with suppliers to ensure development and implementation of capacity building programs and business requirements that address human rights and labor standards and demonstrate compliance on an ongoing basis. At a minimum, the supplier shall run a traceability system enabling the identification of all potential origins, farms, mills, back to fishing vessels, linked with seafood and other ingredients used as part of product recipes. Additionally, the supplier shall operate a seafood responsible sourcing program to ensure that origins identified are continuously assessed and assisted in meeting business requirements detailed in the Nestlé Responsible Sourcing Guidelines. Enforce traceable supply chains, identifying all potential sources of origins as part of a comprehensive supply chain risk assessment. Ensure a verifiable supply chain traceability system as part of a comprehensive supply chain risk assessment that is aligned with industry partners and stakeholders within the Thailand seafood industry, enabling traceability of seafood ingredients from fishing vessels through the complete supply chain to the receiving manufacturing sites and finished products. Define and communicate requirements to boat owners and/or captains, including recruitment practices and living working conditions for boat workers, building on the Marine Catch Purchasing Document or any other industry-recognized best practice. Create a set of requirements for boat owners and captains. Requirements will cover traceability, recruitment practices, fish catching system, living and working conditions for boat workers, a toolkit composed of employment contract template and rules, worker ID cards, template to monitor workers' names, working time, salary, and associated deductions if any. Implement a training program for boat owners and/or captains in association with industry partners and stakeholders within the Thailand seafood industry. Create a training hub to generate awareness and provide education to ensure effective worker protections in priority areas as determined by Verité. The training hub may take the form of a demonstration boat or university where a training program will be given to electrical boat owners, captains as ardent enabler for continuous improvement. The program will include a mechanism to apply for financial support to speed up the implementation of best practices learned. Award financial support in the form of sponsoring or microcredit, for instance, for boat lodging and cooking facilities. Implement an awareness-raising campaign on human rights and labor conditions, targeting primarily boat workers in collaboration with local authority and industry partners and stakeholders in the Thailand seafood industry. create an awareness-raising campaign addressing the areas of labour standards and health and safety at the workplace campaign to be deployed in locations identified as impactful for migrant workforce and linked with regular boat stocking, including the introduction of a grievance mechanism and providing some immediate tangible personal benefits to workers. Campaign will incorporate an anonymous reporting system to identify the worst form of labour conditions to be addressed by the emergency response team. Enable the work of a migrant workforce emergency response team. Identify a third-party partner, for example, Project ISRA, to be considered. Experienced in protecting individuals from the worst form of labour conditions. Deploy and empower this partner organisation as the migrant workforce emergency response team in charge to deploy the necessary assessments to identify individuals in need of immediate assistance. Create and implement a fishing vessels verification program. Implement, at first, an internal audit program verifying working, labour and health and safety at workplace conditions in fishing vessels for 100% of the fleet used, along with monitoring of compliance through key performance indicators. Randomly select boats on a monthly basis to undergo a third-party verification audit by an independent organisation, executed every quarter. Third-party verification audit should include interview of boat workers and establish the history of their working career in the region and country. 400 Part 2 cases in crafting and executing strategy. Companies in industries in which labour trafficking and slavery were rampant. Praising Nestle for self-policing and public reporting. Mark Lagan, president of non-profit anti-trafficking organisation Freedom House, said, "It's unusual and exemplary. The propensity of the PR and legal departments of companies is not to fess up, not to even say they are carefully looking into a problem for fear that they will get hit with lawsuits." 46 Criticism. Though Nestle was applauded for its admission of forced labour within its seafood supply chain and its move toward transparency, some analysts felt that this was just an attempt by the company to cover up bigger allegations of child labour in its profitable chocolate-making business. They felt that in order to escape the charges of being an unethical company, Nestle had admitted to slavery in seafood suppliers, a low-profit area of the company's business, in Thailand. Some critics saw Nestle's actions as a public relations stunt to alleviate the criticism it had received for abetting child slavery in Ivory Coast. For me, there is a big issue with one part of Nestle saying, "Okay, we have been dragged along with everyone else to face the issue of slavery in Thailand, and so let's take the initiative and do something about it," and at the same time fighting tooth and nail through a grievance mechanism allowing anonymous reporting. A fishing vessel verification program involving regular third-party verification of randomly selected boats to assess working conditions, and a training program for boat owners and captains based on best practices. Batato said, "As we've said consistently, forced labour and human rights abuses have no place in our supply chain. Nestle believes that by working with suppliers we can make a positive difference to the sourcing of ingredients." 45 Batato further added that it would be neither a quick nor an easy endeavour, but the company planned to achieve significant progress going forward. By the end of 2016, over 99% of the seafood ingredients that Nestle sourced from its seafood supply chain in Thailand were traceable back to fishing vessels and farms due to actions taken as part of the plan. Nestle worked with Verite, its supplier Thai Union, the Royal Thai Government, and the Southeast Asian Fisheries Development Centre, SEAFDIC, to develop a training program to educate fishing vessel owners, captains, and crew members on living and working conditions on board the boats, and on workers' rights. In March 2016, Nestle partnered with the ISRA Institute, a not-for-profit body focusing on worker voice and grievance mechanisms, to help workers voice their concerns. Experts said Nestle's disclosures and commitment to change served as an example to other objective action. Dedicate resources, appoint an executive from Nestle to implement the action plan. His profile will include coordination with relevant parties, management of implementation activities, establishment of KPIs and dashboard, effective use of internal and financial resources, representation to relevant industry parties and stakeholders. Collaborate and scale up, leverage opportunities for collaboration with industry partners and stakeholders with the Thailand seafood industry and seek to become a member of the Shrimp Sustainable Supply Chain Task Force. share progress on implementation of action plan and learning, contribute to testing of innovative solutions and continuously seek to expand implementation to other supply schemes and locations in Southeast Asia. Achieve similar aims as part of the Good Labour Practices Working Group, convened by Government of Thailand and supported by the International Labour Organization. Publicly report publicly on progress, including challenges and failures identified with how to best resolve and solutions to address. This should include ongoing monitoring of business partners' supply chain management systems by independent third-party assessments and identification of risks and issues to be addressed. The courts to avoid charges of child slavery in its core operations in the Ivory Coast. 47 remarked Andrew Wallace, CEO of anti-human trafficking charity Unseen UK. Analysts said that this apparent double standard had raised doubts among civil society activists and customers regarding Nestlé's true motives. Critics said by its admission, Nestlé had left consumers falsely confident in the goodness of its products. Some anti-trafficking advocates remained highly skeptical of Nestlé's actions and saw the move toward transparency as a tactic to deflate other pending civil litigation suits in its cocoa supply chains. They said Nestlé had been falsely assuring customers that it would eliminate child and forced labour in its Ivory Coast supply chain since 2001, and in the meantime an entire generation of children in West Africa had been suffering due to Nestlé's false promises. Nestlé's admission that it had found slavery in its supply chain in Thailand was greeted with a negative reaction from both traditional and social media. According to the LexisNexis News Desk 48 analysis, mentions of Nestlé in relation to slavery rose steeply, with 20 to 90 articles per week discussing slavery in the company's supply chain. According to the sentiment chart presented in Exhibit 10, more than a third of the coverage was entirely negative, while only 2.5% was positive. Some analysts contended that Nestlé's efforts to eliminate child labour from its global cocoa supply chain were not credible because of its inadequately transparent self-monitoring system. For instance, they pointed out that the company provided incomplete and insufficient information regarding the details of TNCP and its certification schemes, and had omitted material information related to TNCP's distribution and progress in the rest of its global cocoa supply chain. Some analysts pointed out that the FLA investigation was not an accurate representation of the conditions on Nestlé's cocoa farms because a majority of Nestlé's cocoa farms, about 75%, were not part of TNCP. They also said that there was significant discrepancy between Nestlé's grand official policies and statements to combat slavery and the nominal actions it took. Nestlé had yet to develop a concrete plan outlining when it would source entirely sustainable cocoa. They said that TNCP was only a greenwashing ploy aimed at making Nestlé appear to be ethically responsible. Nestlé received some respite in March 2017, when U.S. District Judge Stephen V. Wilson dismissed the case on child slavery in Africa on the ground that the complaint seeks an impermissible extraterritorial application of the Alien Tort Statute, which means companies can be sued in the United States for actions outside the country, but only when some conduct touches and concerns the United States with sufficient force. 49. He said that the former child slaves could not sue in the United States over wrongdoing that had occurred in Africa. The judge said that the plaintiff's attempt to single out CSR initiatives as evidence that Nestlé was knowingly aiding and abetting child slavery was counterproductive because it would freeze company speech and prevent them from taking up such initiatives in the future. He said, even worse, relying on corporate social responsibility programs as relevant conduct would also chill corporations from creating these programs. Corporations would be incentivized to allow human rights abuses to occur without shedding light on the issue or trying to combat it out of fear they will displace the presumption and be held responsible. 50. The way forward. In April 2019, a federal court in California filed a fresh class action lawsuit against Nestlé over claims the company mislabeled its products as sustainable when, in fact, it sourced its cocoa from farms that caused environmental devastation and used child slave labor. However, Nestlé said that it had prevailed in similar lawsuits earlier as it was committed to eliminate forced labor from its supply chain. Forced child labor is unacceptable and has no place in our supply chain. We have explicit policies against it and are working with other stakeholders to combat this global social problem. Regrettably, in bringing such lawsuits, the plaintiffs' class action lawyers are targeting the very organizations trying to fight forced labor, 51 said a Nestle spokesperson. Going forward, analysts said that identifying and tackling the menace of modern slavery in its cocoa supply chain would not be an easy task for Nestle. Nestle's cocoa supply chain was complex, and regulating the cooperatives and farms could be tough for the senior management, they said. It would be challenging to continually follow up on the work of cooperatives given their remote locations, they added. Though Nestle had monitoring systems in place to communicate supplier policies and conduct audits, they often covered only Tier 1 suppliers at the top of the value chain, while forced labor was mostly found in the bottom tiers. Moreover, cost and pricing pressures, supplier engagement, and transparency dilemmas were some of the issues Nestle had to deal with while addressing slavery. The problem is, we can't just stop using a supplier. People ask why we don't boycott them. We did that in the case of palm oil. We delisted suppliers. We delisted coffee suppliers in South America who were using child labor. But it doesn't always solve the bigger problem. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. If we took the view to delist every single supplier who is doing the wrong thing today, it will not improve the situation. It will cut the income of those who rely on this income. It is loss. But, with our size, we believe we can change things over time, 52 said Batato. Modern slavery was considered as a criminal activity often actively hidden by perpetrators, making it difficult to detect. Third-party auditors appointed by Nestle might struggle to get full access to facilities and victims would be unwilling to speak up fearing retribution. Another challenge would be driving workers toward community awareness-raising sessions. Some families were often resistant to change as they had few livelihood alternatives. Moreover, the isolation of some of the farms and villages was a challenge in itself. Supplying school kits and providing literacy classes to women were all the more difficult as a result. Some researchers found that though Nestle's code of conduct prohibited the use of child labor in its supply chain, awareness of the code was low among farmers. Moreover, the farmers did not attend training sessions either due to lack of interest or lack of time. Being a leader in our industry, we do understand we can influence the supply chains we work with, and that's what we do. We recognize it is a difficult issue to deal with, 53 said Marco Gonçalves, Nestle's chief procurement officer. Analysts said that given its global scale and financial prowess, Nestle could play a crucial role in driving significant changes and abolishing slavery from the global cocoa supply chain. Going forward, the question before Nestle was what more the company could do to ensure its cocoa supply chain was free from slavery. How could it assure consumers that its products did not come at the expense of innocent people who went through untold suffering? Could Nestle have a positive impact on the chocolate industry through its honest revelations and by raising the bar on labor protection? Should the company take a clear leadership position on this issue given its influence? If so, how should Nestle go about doing this?